Hello, and welcome to Impacto AZ, a podcast dedicated to centering the Latinx voice on the important issues of the day. My name is Jonathan Higuera. I'm your host, and I'm here along with two of my co-hosts, Juan Rodriguez, the executive producer of Impacto AZ, and David Lopez, a law professor from Arizona State University, who is a distinguished professor of practice there, and also recently founded and leads a new initiative from ASU called the Civil Rights, Migration, and Employment Law Initiative. So congratulations on that, David. Today's guest, I'm very excited and fortunate to have him, is Franc Contreras. Frank is originally from Tucson, Arizona, but has spent the last 4 decades away from his hometown, and has had a very successful career as a broadcast journalist and now as a filmmaker, a documentary filmmaker, and just an all-around good resource in the broadcast journalism field. And I say that because I remember meeting you in Washington, D.C. in the early 90s, and I was a print journalist, and you helped me put together a few radio reports that I believe aired on the early Latino USA shows. And I was always appreciative of that because you really did give me some step-by-step instructions on what it takes to be a good radio journalist. Ultimately, I stuck with print journalism, but I loved doing some of that work. And I'm glad I'm now back to doing a little bit of broadcast with this YouTube channel. So with that, why don't we start out by letting our viewers know a little bit about yourself, where you're from, how you were, some of the important points in your life that led you to your current position, and things like that.
Thanks so much, Jonathan, Juan, David. I'm glad to be with you and your great audience here on this show. As you said it, I was born and raised in Tucson, but I want to be a little more specific. I was raised on the south side of Tucson. What does that mean? It was a mostly Mexican-American barrio. That's where my parents are from, and our grandparents are from the northern part of Mexico, Sonora State. I grew up speaking English, but surrounded by Mexican culture. But one thing was really clear to me, that back in the day when I was growing up in that part of southern Arizona, the media rarely mentioned the word Mexico. It seemed so strange because we used to go down to Nogales. You guys remember, maybe you did that, cross the border, have some good cheese, have some good ice cream and different foods and things and it was just a different world. So close to us and yet so different. And we were part of it and yet we were not. So that was really fascinating to me. But it stuck in my brain that, that stories needed to be told about our ties to Mexico. And so that was kind of something that was deep inside of me from way back. I grew up with my cousins there on the south side. One time we went to a Radio Shack, purchased that little kit that you could get back in the day to create a shortwave radio. Did you guys ever do that?
Yeah.
You build a little shortwave radio and you could tune in, and with these little headphones you could hear voices from distant places like Denver, Colorado, or in one moment I remember listening to Radio Habana, Cuba from Cuba, coming all the way from Cuba to southern Arizona, and that just kind of stayed in my mind, my imagination, that we could get ideas, that we could get different voices and cultures and different aspects of our cultures from far away, broadcast over the airwaves back in the day. Now it's on the internet. So I think I had in my mind that I wanted to work with that. I didn't know what I could do. I didn't know that I could become a journalist. Eventually, I was able to find that road and worked at KUNM Public Radio in Albuquerque first. Then I got a really amazing job at National Public Radio in Washington, D.C., maybe one of the first Chicano producers, because there have been some correspondents, but producers working on the daily news show there. And things were going really, really well for me at National Public Radio in Washington in the early 1990s. Then I got a call from a great friend, a mutual friend that Jonathan and I share, Maria Martin. And Maria said, "Hey, Frank, we're going to create a radio program called Latino USA. What do you think? Do you want to quit your amazing job at NPR and join us?" And I said, "Absolutely, of course I would do it." And so
You
Maria,
said, of course, a lot of people would have given pause there. Let's see. I'm a
I was
producer in D.C. for NPR, but
I was at
You
the
made
top
the
of the
right call.
heap. I was at the
Yeah.
top of the heap in the public radio world to a lot of folks, but to me, you know, Latino USA offered the opportunity to tell our stories and to learn more. And so I was really on the production side, the technical side when I was at NPR in Washington. But with Maria Martin and Maria Hinojosa at NPR's Latino USA in Austin, Texas at the time, I was trained to become a script writer. And then I became more of a journalist. I did study journalism and philosophy in university at a small school in Davenport, Iowa. But it wasn't until I got to Latino USA in the mid 1990s that I was able to actually start to learn to write and learn to tell these stories. And we had an amazing correspondent in Mexico City, Sandina Robbins, and one day she broke the bad news to me in 1995. The Zapatista uprising had already happened. She was covering it tremendously. The NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, had already come into effect, and it felt like historic times to me. And Sandina Robbins, our correspondent in Mexico City, said that she needed to resign. She wanted to return home to raise her children in the Bay Area of San Francisco. And I was just kind of heartbroken. I was just wondering who could ever fill her shoes. And she said to me, well, Frank, why don't you do it? So I think it wasn't 10 days later that I was walking around in the main plaza of Mexico City, still monolingual at the time. You guys know a lot of our families and us, we grow up speaking only English after a number of generations, right? This is pretty common. So, I would listen to my parents and grandparents speak Spanish in the kitchen, but it was always English in my mind. So I'm walking around Mexico City and I decide that I'm going to stay for a decade. And that was 1996.
Oh, wow. Now, let's see.
Yeah.
Let me do the math here.
Yeah, almost
Three decades.
3 decades. Yeah,
Three
3 decades
decades
later.
later, you're
And
still here.
so many things that I've seen in those years, in those times. The opportunities to tell stories about Mexico, to travel into the American Southwest and do stories about Mexico in the United States and our ties to that. So it's really been an amazing experience for me. That's a little bit of a nugget of what I've seen and
That
done.
gives us a good timeline and a little chronology of how your career has progressed. And being in Mexico City that early to today, I'm curious to know the changes you've seen in that city alone, right? Because hasn't there
Oh,
been,
yeah.
it's not the same Mexico City that I visited. I haven't been there since the 80s, believe it or not. But tell us a little bit about what it was then and what it is now.
I think Mexico City has transformed maybe 2 or 3 times since I've been here. When I first got here, the public spaces were dark. People wouldn't go out much. It seemed like it was a little scary, like it wasn't that clean. You didn't see a lot of things like you see now, like bicycle paths. Cars yielding for bicycles to pass through intersections. That was just unheard of. And it was a different kind of a city. It didn't feel like the well-being of the local residents was a top priority. And it seems to me that over time, that idea has transformed and has become a place where people can live a very healthy, good lifestyle. We still have, of course, a lot of air pollution. That's still a major issue. But overall, I would tell you that I live a very good life here, and it's a safe place for the most part.
And you can take a taxi now. I remember there was a time there when you were really rolling the dice when you took a taxi from somewhere.
Back in the day when I got here, the taxis were little Volkswagens, green colored, because they were supposedly ecologically friendly. You could get into those taxis, and sometimes there was this thing called the secuestro express, the express kidnapping. The driver would be in cahoots with somebody who would jump in, and then they would take you until midnight and take out money from your ATM account.
Right. I remember that crisis.
Those things have changed. Now we use Uber like you do, and other services. Lyft is here. It's safer and more reliable, and those things have transformed.
To visit. My co-hosts here have been there recently, so they have gotten a real sense of that.
I've been down to Mexico City several times and spent some significant time there. Obviously it's a complex global city, and so I don't want to uplift it too much, but I think just traveling on Insurgentes to Santa Fe had to be as beautiful as any place in the world. And it's a city that, really functions very well. It's super interesting. And to be honest, it's my favorite place in the world.
Yeah.
But I know it has many layers. Like, in the legal profession, we would talk about the summer associate programs. And of course, most people who go to Mexico the first time end up in Mexico City. So Mexico presents itself very well, but a lot of the problems, a lot of the challenges are going on outside of Mexico City. Not that Mexico City doesn't have its problems, but the rest of the country, is, I've heard it said that there are three Mexicos, right? That the regional differences there are pretty profound. And I've also heard people in Mexico City say there's Mexico City and then there's Mexico, right? But as a city, Mexico City is certainly, to me, on par with a New York City or a Tokyo.
Let's talk about that a little more, because now we have a Mexico City under President Claudia Sheinbaum,
who was a mayor,
who was the mayor, correct? Yeah, and continues that tradition. I guess the Cardenas administration, right, was a mayor there as well, was he not, for a long time? But tell us what the mood is right now, as far as you can tell, if not just Mexico City, but all of Mexico, the best you can. I know you don't know what's going on in Oaxaca necessarily, like I don't know what's going on in Maine, but tell us what the feeling is right now with Claudia Sheinbaum as the president.
I do have the luck of being able to travel around the country quite a bit because of the work I do as a television news correspondent now. In Mexico City, you guys know, the city itself has a population of around 8 million. That's a lot of people. But if you add together the metropolitan area, the giant area that wraps around the city, it's a state called the State of Mexico, Estado de Mexico. And if you add that in, we're talking about something like 25 million people. Okay, so it's one of the biggest metropolitan areas in the Americas, certainly, and definitely in the world. I would agree with David. This is a world-class city. I put it on par with Rome, Tokyo, New York. It has all those kinds of offerings. Claudia Sheinbaum was a former mayor here. She brought improvements. She brought things like electrified trolley buses using solar panels that were set up on top of a giant marketplace called the Central de Abastos. It's one of the largest markets in the world where farmers from all over the country bring their goods. It's all concentrated there and then distributed from that area to the rest of the city and the rest of the central part of Mexico. And the central part of Mexico, by the way, is where the vast majority of the 130 million Mexicans live. So this is a very important section here. So on top of the roofs of that Central de Abastos, you now see it covered with solar panels, powering those trolley buses. So those are some of the things that Sheinbaum did as mayor. Remember, she has a PhD in sustainable energy engineering. Okay, and she did a lot of that work in really high-end universities in Northern California. So she's quite well trained in that. Mexico City still has areas that are dealing with crime issues. I tend to think that the way it's covered in the United States seems to exaggerate that more than what the real feeling that I get. Certainly, if you live in those areas that are affected, I don't. But if you live in those areas that are affected, I'm sure people, it's more in their face. They can really, feel problems like extortions, for example. That is an issue that's taking place around the country. If you're not facing drug violence in places like Michoacan or Sinaloa State or Tamaulipas State, very specific areas, oftentimes small businesses will be facing issues of extortion. So some of that is taking place. In the area where I live, it's a place called Alcaldía Benito Juárez. Think of that as sort of the boroughs of New York. Benito Juárez is one of, I think, 16 boroughs that Mexico City has. This is a fairly safe place. It's been compared to parts of Germany, the kind of infrastructure, the kind of schools and things like that people can have here in this part of Mexico City.
So is it safe to say that she is a very popular president? And I say this because I saw those images of the protests a few weeks ago, and it didn't square with what I've been hearing, but what can you say about that?
Images are so powerful, aren't they? How they allow us to think or believe about something. Claudia Sheinbaum, depending on which newspaper poll you're reading, she has approval ratings ranging from 70% approval up to 80% approval. And these are polls that are taken from organizations that have done polling for decades here. They're considered reliable polls. Gallup polls show the same sort of outcomes. An organization called Mitofsky, Roy Campos, has been doing public opinion polling for decades here, and he finds that her approval ratings are hovering around 70, 75%. So that's one of the highest approval ratings of a leader anywhere in the world at this stage. There are definitely people who are not happy with her. There are people who think that government should not be helping poor people. This is one of the things that the government of the political party she belongs to, the Morena party, focuses on heavily. They're doing things like raising the minimum wage. In the last 7 years since this party has been in power at the federal level, they have lifted, according to the World Bank, by the way, this is not information coming from the party itself, but from outside sources that are, good, strong economic sources. They're telling us that they have lifted at least 13 million Mexicans out of poverty. What does that mean exactly, lifting you out of poverty? You might still live in a poor area, but now you have more disposable income to improve your lifestyle. So this is taking place here. But there are those people who believe that, the Morena party should not be helping out poor people. Some people tell me, Frank, you're just training them to be lazy. The idea that the poor people have their hand out and they're just waiting for free pesos, and then they're going to sit around at home and watch telenovelas all day long. I'm sure that there are people who do things like that, but I think that the majority of Mexicans who I've met in these 30 years here, they want to work. They want to work hard. They want to improve their lives. They want to advance. So there are
So what was behind the protest then, as far as you can tell?
Well, that's a difficult one to unravel, Jonathan. There are sources who say that there are organizations from right-wing organizations, like in the United States and around Europe, that are bringing money and funds to Mexico in order to try to rebuild a right-wing party. The right-wing party here that had power for 2 consecutive administrations, beginning with Felipe Calderon in 2006, they held power here, but that party was dealing head on with the problem of drug trafficking violence, and they decided to use the force of the military against that. That created a lot more bloodshed, and so it was hard for them to maintain power. People got concerned about that. So what's behind the latest protests here? You saw strong images from the main plaza here in Mexico City, clashes with protesters who opposed the government. And in some cases, they left, there was some violence. There was, I think, 14 city police officers who were left hospitalized in intensive care. They were quite injured. And so the clashes were pretty brutal. The police did not react the way we have seen in previous administrations, where they cracked down hard. Mexico was known for that for many decades when there was one-party rule here. So it's really hard to say exactly. I have no evidence to tell you what I think is behind it. Could there be outside financing? Potentially. The president says that's what's taking place. I have no evidence to show that, nor have I had the opportunity to seek it out very much. So
ostensibly they were saying that they were protesting ongoing violence, right? And cartel violence. Did I read that correctly?
That's one of the concerns that they have. Yeah, that there was a mayor that was killed in November. He was the mayor of a place called Uruapan, Michoacan. That's the world epicenter for avocado production. When you eat avocados around Super Bowl time, probably you're eating avocados from the Uruapan area of Michoacan.
And I have been to Uruapan, and it is one of the most beautiful places on earth. I mean,
it's lovely.
The places I visited were just
It's
amazing.
very beautiful. It's quite green and very productive. Agriculture sector is very strong. But we have heard reports in recent months that agricultural producers there, especially in the avocado sector, a very wealthy sector, by the way. It's mechanized. It looks like high-tech avocado production, if you can imagine that. And they've been facing massive extortions. The mayor of the city of Uruapan was murdered recently, and he was trying to stand up against drug trafficking cartels. And so a lot of the blame went to the federal government. People in the opposition said that the federal government did nothing to help him. The government said that they were in the process of protecting him. So it's hard to unravel that one, as oftentimes happens in any country, I think.
Frank,
Can I drill down just a little bit? I think in the United States, given everything that's happening politically, a person like Sheinbaum, who I would argue speaks English better than Donald Trump, and is certainly, somebody who's very learned. Seems like she has almost like a Gorbachev quality. But, when I go to Mexico, I talk to a lot of people because I think we're all at that age where like you got to talk to people instead of read stuff all the time. And what happens is that when I ask the cab driver, what they think, the cab drivers love her, right? The working people love her. And I've been doing this many years. There are not many politicians that the working people have loved in that country. But for some reason, the lawyers and the professionals seem to feel just great antipathy for her, at least the ones that I come across, right? And I think in the United States. So if I can just raise a couple of the issues that people have raised with me. The first is the judicial reform. So I'm a lawyer, by training. And I know the judicial reforms were controversial, maybe more in the United States than in Mexico, but they were controversial. So do you want to talk a little bit about the judicial reforms?
Yes, that was a critical change that took place in Mexico. For the first time ever this year, Mexicans voted to install Supreme Court justices who now have term limits. So now voters are deciding who the Supreme Court justices are in Mexico. But it's not just the Supreme Court. It's justices and judges all the way through the system, the federal systems, the state systems, and even down to the local areas. Criticism was that how could poor people vote for people they don't know? How could they know who would be a good judge? How could they make a good decision, an informed decision on who would be a professional judge? What if somebody wanted to run to become a judge, but they had no experience? Things like that were the concerns. And so there was some controversy, but I think you're right. It was more controversial among news media in the United States than it was here. There was turnout. It looked like it was low turnout, but this was the first time ever in the history of Mexico that people had the opportunity to vote for their judges. And so Sheinbaum's argument and the argument from her Morena party and the predecessor to her, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who was the previous president, they argued that there was a lot of corruption and a lot of nepotism inside the judicial system, and that was creating all sorts of issues and problems to bring justice at the federal bench level. And so the idea is that you can have a clean slate now and start over again. People are concerned that it could become politicized. There are rules in place. You cannot use like heavy advertising campaigns during these, things of that sort. And so it's still a brand new thing. It just took place this year. It is now in place, and there were people who were serving as judges who did not get elected into office to become judges holding seats now as elected officials. But there were others who did get that. So it's quite a mixed bag. But I think that inside Mexico, you mainly hear foreign corporations concerned about that. They're concerned that, that laws that are created to protect foreign interests here could eventually harm investment. It seems at this stage that there's no indication that that's taking place. Direct foreign investment is still fairly strong in Mexico, even among U.S. companies and even Chinese companies and European companies.
And I bet that transatlantic train that goes from the Pacific to the Atlantic that opened not that long ago is probably going to be a big boost, if not to foreign investment, all types of investment. Is that having an impact there as well?
It's starting to. This is just a very brand new thing. So this is a train that crosses that most narrow point in Mexico down in the southern part of the country near the states of Chiapas, Oaxaca, Veracruz. And you guys know what that is. It's basically a train that connects the Pacific side over to the Caribbean side. And it's a train that can move mass amounts of cargo. And so what it becomes is a sort of land version of the Panama Canal.
Yeah.
And you're going... Yes, and I was just going to say, you're going to get increasing shipping coming from Asia, not just China, but a number of other countries, and they're going to have stronger infrastructure in the ports on the Pacific side. Now they can move products across that isthmus over to the other side, and it basically makes transportation more efficient in this region of the world.
Kind of modernizes Mexico.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
there were a
David.
couple of things I wanted to raise, but I'm glad you raised that because I had spent some time at UNAM, and I know that there were protests against the train also from indigenous communities and environmental groups. And I don't know if you want to, sort of talk about that too in terms of the politics of what surely is going to be, an economic boost, to the country, but also some of the blowback.
Yes, thank you, David. So we're talking about a number of different train systems here, okay? One thing that the Morena Party is doing right now quite heavily is creating more train systems. They're not going for bullet trains yet, but now we have a train that takes people from the state capital of Mexico State, that's Toluca, here to the capital city. So they no longer have to drive in. That's one thing that took place. There is a train that's being built to connect Mexico City to Nogales. So if you guys ever want to ride a train down to Mexico City in the not too distant future, you'll be able to do that. But let's talk about the trains in question here. The first train that we mentioned was at the Isthmus. This is mainly for cargo transportation. But the main concern for indigenous communities was a train system in southeastern Mexico in the Mayan regions, the mostly Mayan regions, known as the Tren Maya, the Mayan train. And it basically is a large loop. I now, after so many years in Mexico, I think in kilometers, no longer in miles, but it's something like 1,500 kilometers, the loop. And it starts in Mérida, and it goes down to Cancun, Tulum, down to a place called Bacalar. You may know it, those beautiful crystal blue lakes of fresh water in that area of southern Quintana Roo state. Then it curves back into the jungle toward the state of Chiapas, passing through some tremendous areas of archaeological remains that from the ancient Mayan cultures of that area. It loops back to Campeche state and then reconnects in Mérida. So it's a giant loop, mostly for tourism, and you're starting to see more and more Mexicans all along that route. You see a lot of indigenous towns, and we traveled the entire route, my camera team and I, to find out what people were thinking about that. We watched trees being cut down in areas that were pristine jungle areas. There were concerns that wildlife could be harmed. Certainly that takes place whenever you do any kind of so-called development,
like
right? Yeah, I'm sure that happened on the street where I live when it used to be a forest here, and now it's a paved over street where traffic passes through, and people think of that as development, as progress. But the indigenous people we spoke with were mostly in favor of it. They said that they were going to be able to get the train and ride it to some of the tourist areas like Tulum and have better paying jobs there. And then I said, well, aren't you concerned about your land and and they said, well, one of the things that they were angry about in Quintana Roo state is they were getting less per square meter from the federal government when they were being purchased, the land was being purchased compared to the people in the state of Yucatan where the prices were higher, the amount of money they were earning for the pay from the government for the land to create this giant train system. But the train will carry not just passengers, but also a lot of cargo as well. So it's going to be used for both. It depends on how you view the world. Do you want the southeastern part of Mexico that's always been one of the poorest areas in all of Mexico? Do you want that place to see this kind of economic development, or would you prefer to leave it as it was? So it depends on where you fall in that argument.
Yeah.
Yeah, your pristine state, but in pretty dire poverty.
Impoverished. Frank, I want to leave time. I want to make sure we talk a little bit, and we could pick your brains all day on these topics, these issues in Mexico, because you obviously are on top of it. But I also want to talk a little bit about the projects you're working on, and we got to get to the Plume, your big project right now. But tell us who you're filing stories for. What are some of the ones you've done recently? And then let's lead right into the Plume from there, because I want our audience to hear about that as well.
Over the years, we've done a lot of broadcasting for major television producers from around the world, including the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. They do a lot of drug trafficking stories. They don't do too many stories about other aspects of Mexico. I've been working also with the BBC World Service Television on occasion, but mostly lately, I'm actually working with a broadcast coming out of China, and it's called China Global Television Network, or CGTN. Now, I want to tell you, I do the exact same kind of journalism for them that I was doing at National Public Radio. The same kind of analysis, the same kind of fair and balanced approach. They mostly have me, and this probably won't surprise any of you, they mostly have me doing business stories. They want to know about the business climate in Mexico and what tariff threats from Washington mean for relations between China, Mexico, and the United States. Major economists I speak with on a regular basis, including former ambassadors, Mexican ambassadors to China, they tell us that the relationship is definitely an economic triangle. You cannot separate China outside of that mix, because U.S. companies doing business in Mexico are using Chinese parts to keep their prices low, and then ship those manufactured goods to consumers at lower prices until they get hit with tariffs, if they do, into the United States market. So the triangular...
Are the Chinese interested in getting their electric cars into Mexico? Is that one part of the equation there?
They already are, Jonathan. Every time I call an Uber, maybe out of 10 times that I call it, 8 of them are a brand called BYD. That's a Chinese brand. That's one of the biggest selling car brands in the world now. It is a major brand that is selling in places like Germany, and they're one of the major manufacturers of batteries for electric vehicles. And so we see an increasing number of electric vehicles in Mexico City, Monterrey, and Guadalajara, the big cities.
But you mentioned something. You mentioned, I believe you said St. Ambrose College?
That's right, yes.
Yeah. I grew up not too far from there.
Are you serious?
On the Illinois side.
Quad Cities.
The Quad Cities. Oh my! I can't believe it.
Quad Cities. My father worked for John Deere, and
oh wow!
There.
Well, I went to school. Yes.
Yeah, and it's I'm just fascinated and surprised by the amount of people in my travels and in my life that I come across that went to St. Ambrose.
That is incredible to me. Yeah. I learned so much. It was a small Catholic school, still is, and they gave you such a strong liberal arts education. Yeah. You know, you study sociology along with psychology and how to become a good reporter as well. Plus, they also had the broadcast tools to do actual radio programming and television. Right. So it was really an excellent, outstanding education. And it's so amazing to hear you say this, Juan. Wow. Shout out to David Baker. He's the general manager. I went to school with David, and David opened space for Spanish language broadcasting in the Quad Cities. It's beautiful. That's where I got my start in radio, at that station.
Went up game, but I went to Utterback Junior High School, so I lived in South Tucson for many years in my upbringing. So I'm not sure. Did you go to Pueblo, or would you go to Tucson High, or?
I went to Sunnyside.
Oh, you went to Sunnyside. Oh, yeah, that's right there. That's South Tucson.
Yeah, way on the south side, yeah. And I'll be heading back this Wednesday. On Saturday, the 13th of December, there's going to be a major environmental justice event in the Mission Manor Park in Tucson, Arizona. Our local representative, I should say our federal government representative in the Congress, Adelita Grijalva, will be there. We're going to have the mayor, Regina Romero. She'll be speaking, and a lot of other people, environmental activists. We're marking anniversaries that basically damaged the aquifer that was the main source of water for Tucson back in the years when I was growing up. And way before that, there was a military weapons factory owned by Howard Hughes. They were building missiles that were used in places like Vietnam. And during the years, from the 60s, 70s, 80s, The weapons manufacturer was dumping chemicals clandestinely into the desert at night, and a lot of people got sick and died of cancers. My own mother died of cancer. She was 34 years old, and so this is a very personal story for me. On Saturday, the 13th of December, we'll be filming a major event there, and this will appear in the film.
What have you learned doing this process? I mean, is this the longest documentary you've done to date, or tell us a little bit more about your light bulb moments in doing the research on this?
It was really something because the contamination event took place from the 1950s up until the 1980s when it was made public by journalists who did investigative reporting. They were getting information from local activists, mostly Mexican American women from my neighborhood there. But I didn't learn about this. I told you my mother died from cancer, but that was in 1974, 10 years before this was made public. So it wasn't until I moved to Albuquerque, I mentioned that I worked at KUNM, and back in the early 1990s, there was a group of people there, Richard Moore, Sofia Martinez, and a number of other people who created a national organization. It was called the Southwest Network for Environmental and Economic Justice, and they were the ones who told me about what was happening in Tucson. So I learned about it a decade later in Albuquerque, and then moving to Mexico, I just kept reading about it and learning more and more. And I guess what I learned was that a lot of this history was swept under the rug, partly because it was, Hughes Aircraft at the time was the major employer in southern Arizona. So,
that's right.
And I also think that back in that time, there weren't a lot of environmental protection regulations in place. The Environmental Protection Agency wasn't even created yet when the dumping first started. And the Environmental Protection Agency created something called the Superfund program to attend to the most contaminated communities in all of the United States. And the south part of Tucson was placed on that list early on in the 1980s. So these are things that I learned. But I also learned about how a community can come together and become resilient in the face of this kind of threat against public health and lifestyles. A lot of our families died of cancers, and when your mother dies of cancer and you're a little boy, your family just turns in on itself. You have to survive. You have to figure out how to get the laundry done, how to get to school on time, how to get breakfast, things like that, so you don't talk to your neighbors and you don't learn that they too suffered the same problem. So now what we're seeing is the communities coming together and speaking out publicly, and now we have elected officials who come from our barrios, and they're people who hold this as a high priority. We know that we're in a time when the Environmental Protection Agency is being dismantled. A lot of the offices that were created to enhance what they call environmental justice, that has a racial dimension, by the way, because a lot of these communities being dumped on are communities of color, right, throughout the United States. And so a lot of those offices are being completely dismantled. Hundreds of people have been let go by the current government. Funding has been cut, and a lot of the protections are disappearing. We saw the other day that the federal government is going to allow chemicals that have something called PAFS compounds in them. These are the so-called forever chemicals that stay in our bodies essentially for our lifetimes. They can be transmitted on to next generations. So a lot of these protections are being lifted. So I think that the film has a historic dimension, but there's also something to say about our current situation, our current times.
Right.
That's powerful. We ought to go down, Jonathan. Want to go down?
Yeah, we ought to.
Join us if you can. That's Saturday, December 13th in the Mission Manor Park, 2 to 5 p.m. If you can join us. It's going to be historic. And we're going to see people holding up photos of dearly departed loved ones, and there's going to be mariachi music and good food. And so I think it's not all going to be sad and boohoo. There's also going to be some strong, uplifting words from our leaders and from our local activists.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely need joy at this time too, as a form of resistance. I'm wondering if you could connect this, very powerful story. It's a personal story, it's a family story, it's a South Tucson story to your work in Mexico. And I know that recently the United States basically announced and has demonstrated that they're kind of reviving with the fury, the Monroe Doctrine, that basically that everything happens in the Western Hemisphere. And I think so many people across the world are really shocked by these what appear to be extrajudicial killings off the coast of Venezuela. And that impacts Mexico too, because Mexico has 2 or 3 cartels that have been identified as terrorist organizations. So I'm wondering if you could sort of connect the local and the kind of the international climate in terms of where you are, for your work in Mexico City.
Well, we know that manufacturing takes place all over the world, and chemical dumping into water systems, especially underground water systems. This is an issue all across the United States, but also throughout Latin America, and in fact, throughout the world. So this has resonance everywhere you look, anywhere you turn to. In terms of the kind of relationship with the United States, a lot of the companies doing business in Mexico oftentimes are from the United States. They're from other countries as well, but a lot of them are from the United States, and they would like to see relaxed regulations that allow them to discharge some of these chemicals into waterways. The problem is that definitely has an impact on public health. So you can see communities in Mexico living around rivers that are now called dead rivers. They're filled with contamination. They reek. They smell horrible, and people living around them are living in cancer clusters. So this has resonance on both sides of the border easily, this story. Remember that from the White House, a reporter asked President Donald Trump, would you send troops to Mexico to fight the drug cartels in Mexico? And he said that would be okay with me. So Mexico quietly, we've been speaking to Defense Department officials here, the Secretary of Defense called Sedena, and they tell us that definitely they're on alert. They do not want to see U.S. troops and boots on the ground here. The Mexican government tells President Trump that we can handle it on this side, thanks. If we can share information, share intelligence, that is something the United States has provided over the years. That is very helpful. There are also extraditions that take place. You guys know that some of the biggest names in drug trafficking, El Chapo Guzman, people like that, were sent back to the United States to serve their prison terms. But we also saw very recently the former president of Honduras, who was convicted of drug trafficking, Juan Orlando Hernandez, was jailed for 45 years in the United States, and President Trump just pardoned him. So yeah. People are wondering from here, what side of this is the reality? Are you really trying to fight drugs, or is there something else afoot here? Is there some sort of political dimension to this?
Yeah, I'm heading down there at the beginning of January. I haven't been in Guadalajara in ages, but I'm going to be doing some work with the immigrant rights organization, and that's obviously a big issue on both sides. And one of the criticisms I've heard in civil society is that the rhetoric in Mexico around immigration is very welcoming and very, very humane and human rights oriented, but the facts on the ground with the vertical border and Tapachula and the Guardia Nacional, it can be very brutal. And
Absolutely.
I'm just wondering, what types of activities there are in civil society to push back on that, and also about one thing that I really appreciate about Sheinbaum. And this, that, used to be, if you were a pocho, if you came to the United States, you betrayed your country. But she was very welcoming of the Mexican diaspora. And I just am really curious as to sort of reintegration efforts of people who are either voluntarily repatriating or have been sent back.
So let me attend that last question first. There are definitely thousands and thousands of Mexicans either on their own choosing to return or being deported from the United States, being caught up in these ICE raids, some of them quite brutal ICE raids, being separated from their families. The Mexican government is welcoming them. They're providing them with some financing when they arrive, so there's money available so they can pay the rent the first month. They're trying to find job training programs and things of that sort. There's also efforts to attend to their health care early on when they're brought back to Mexico. We've seen deportation flights coming from the United States landing here in the area around Mexico City, and immediately the first thing they get is attention from medical doctors. So there's an attempt to try to attend to them. Certainly there's members of those groups who are being deported back to Mexico that are not getting that kind of attention, but the federal government says it's doing what it can to try to give that kind of support that people need. In terms of civil society and what's being done here for migrants, I will tell you this: Mexico has never been so Haitian. Mexico has never,
or Venezuelan.
Or Venezuelan. That's right. Mexico has never been so Venezuelan. And
Meaning they're accepting those migrants, right?
meaning that they're here, whether they're accepted or not. A lot of them are being deported as well back to their countries from Mexico. Mexico has agreements with governments in Caracas and Haiti to deport people back to their home country. So Mexico's also doing some of that. But what I mean is that a lot of undocumented immigrants trying to make their way to the United States. Once President Trump came into office, his second term, they realized that they were not going to make it, so they decided to stay here. So you see large encampments of Haitians in certain places around Mexico. I've been in touch with one family, a friend it's a source who has become a friend. His name is John Daniel. He's from a place called Jacmel on the coast in Haiti, and he migrated here all the way from Chile. He left his homeland in Haiti, tried to find work in the Dominican Republic, couldn't. He found himself in Brazil and then migrated to Chile, and then there was a lot of discrimination there, he said. So he walked much of the distance through South America and Central America up to Mexico with the idea that he could be based here trying to make it to the States. That never happened. Now he was, for years, trying to bring his wife and son here to Mexico City, and just the other day I got a message on a system that we use here called WhatsApp, and John Daniel tells me that his wife finally joined him in Mexico. So there's opportunities for them to become naturalized citizens of Mexico, and they stand out. This is a country that has Afro-Mexicans. They're mostly on the southern coast, but in the cities you don't see that many people of African origins or Haitian origins. Places like Tijuana and Mexico City, that's changing. So
Right.
So this is really...
Jonathan
All right,
and I took Jonathan.
we are going to start to wrap this up. So David, you're going to make your comment, and then we're going to. It's obvious we could talk to Frank all day on these topics, but let's
Yeah. No, thank you for telling those stories. I was just going to mention that when you and I were down in one of the border trips in Nogales, Sonora, we met that Haitian family, and the woman just had a baby, and the husband kept saying something in Creole. And what he was saying very proudly is that I have a Mexican son. I have a Mexican son.
That's right.
Yeah.
So they have birthright citizenship in Mexico too.
Right off the border wall.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, this has been a fascinating discussion. We've learned so much. One quick comment, and then we're going to wrap it up.
Real quick, Frank. After your December 13th showing in Tucson, what plans do you have to share your project, your film with people here in the U.S.?
So this event that we're going to record on December 13th, that's a sort of climax moment in the film, but we still have to go back throughout 2026 and do a lot of filming. This movie will be a sort of road trip, and it'll start with an antique Volkswagen Bug departing Mexico, driving through the coast and coming through Sonora, on its way across the border over to the south side of Tucson to discover or maybe rediscover the history of what took place through this reporter's eyes and the contacts of the people who have been living it and living as activists. So we've got to go back and film a lot of that still. We're planning to do major editing probably in late 2026, and maybe sometime in 2027, we're hoping you might be able to see the film at a place called the Fox Theater in Tucson for its world premiere. But if we can also show it in Phoenix, and then after that, try to figure out how to get it out. We want to turn it into educational. Thank you.
We'll bring it to Arizona State. I promise.
Oh, I would love to have it show there. Thank you.
Well, this has been a fascinating discussion. I want to thank my guest, of course, Franc Contreras, my co-host, for adding illuminating comments and questions as well. And if you like the content we have here, please like and subscribe to Impacto AZ. We can be found on this YouTube channel, and we appreciate your support. So with that, thank you, and everybody have a nice day, and we look forward to future conversations.
Thanks to all of you. Thank you very much.